Israel ramps up its military campaign by bombing Iranian targets inside Syria. That's after the Syrian regime downed an Israeli jet. Is this the start of a new phase in the conflict? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is the soaring tension between Israel and Iran. For the first time in more than 30 years, an Israeli plane has been shot out of the sky. A Syrian regime missile took out the fighter jet after a wave of Israeli airstrikes hit Iranian targets inside Syria. They were in response to what the Israelis say was an Iranian drone launched from Syria that entered the airspace over the occupied Golan Heights. Iran calls the claim ridiculous. Nevertheless, the Israeli military retaliated with its heaviest air raid on Syria in decades. Russia is urging all sides to show restraint. But will that be enough to prevent a showdown between Israel and Iran? That debate in a moment, but first, here's this report by Christine Pirovolakis.
I've been warning for some time about the dangers of Iran's military entrenchment in Syria. Iran seeks to use Syrian territory to attack Israel for its professed goal of destroying Israel. This morning, Iran brazenly violated Israel's sovereignty. They dispatched an Iranian drone from Syrian territory into Israel, and this demonstrates that our warnings were 100% correct. Israel holds Iran and its Syrian host responsible for today's aggression. We will continue to do whatever is necessary to protect our sovereignty and our security.
Israel launched raids against Iranian and Syrian targets after intercepting and destroying the drone. Israel jets flew into Syria, and the Syrian regime launched anti-aircraft missiles in retaliation. In the end, a plane was hit, going down in northern Israel. In response, Israel says it carried out a second wave of airstrikes on Syria, its heaviest against the country since 1982.
از طریق تقویت تروریسم یا مداخله در کشورهای دیگر یا بمباران کشورهای همسایه می تواند به نتایج مطلوبی برسد در خطا و اشتباه است. ما آمادگی داریم برای امنیت منطقه بیش از گذشته فعال باشیم و در این راستا همکاری همه کشورها را طالب هستیم.
It raises the question, is Israel increasingly being drawn into a fight against Iran and Syria? Christine Pirovolakis, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss all of this, I'm joined from Jerusalem by Alan Baker. He's a former Israeli ambassador and used to be a legal advisor to the Israeli army. In London, we have Russia expert and political commentator Marcus Papadopoulos. And completing our panel, we have Mohammed Marandi. He's a professor at the University of Tehran. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. There's a bunch of things for us to kind of get through here because it's been a busy week, right? We have the Iranian drone. Iran says they didn't send a drone entering Israeli airspace, downed by Israel. Israel bombing Syrian regime positions where they say the Iranians are operating. Syria shooting down an Israeli F-16 jet. And Israel, of course, building a wall along the border with Lebanon that Lebanon says is on their side of the border. Lots to get through, all interconnected, that we will get through over the next 20 minutes or so. But let me begin with a very basic question to you, Alan Baker. At the moment, who is provoking whom? Is Israel provoking Iran, or is Iran provoking Israel?
No, the fact that Iran sent a drone into Israeli sovereign territory would appear to me to be an example of a provocation by Iran. So I don't think there's any room for doubt.
No room for doubt, Mohammed Marandi?
Obviously, it's the Israeli regime that's provocative, as it always is. There was no drone, and all drones that are active in Syria, they are there to fight against ISIS and al-qaeda. And the Israeli regime, as we all know, is cooperating with al-qaeda on its border. The former head of Mossad admitted that the Israelis actually treat the wounded al-qaeda soldiers, the Nusra Front soldiers. And the former defense minister of Israel said that once ISIS lobbed a mortar into Israel and immediately apologized. So we know the sort of relationship that they have. And even if, let's imagine that a drone strayed into their territory. Is that comparable to the constant airstrikes that the Israeli regime carries out against Syrian government positions, or the fact that the Israeli regime sends its Air Force jets over Lebanon to attack Syria? There's no comparison. So I think the Israeli regime really has to reconsider what it sees as a provocation.
Yeah, before I bring in Marcus, let me get a response from you, Alan, and just add to it. I mean, what does Israel want? Is it merely to respond and scupper whether it's Hezbollah or other Iranian militias within Syria, or does Israel have greater designs and greater intentions of getting more involved in the Syrian war?
No, Israel's got absolutely no intention of getting involved in anything like that. Israel just wants to ensure its own security, and Israel considers that the presence of Iran in Syria, by Iran's own declarations, it constitutes a very serious threat to Israel. And Israel has warned Iran several times that it won't countenance its presence or its building up of facilities to assist Hezbollah and other terrorist groups in order to attack Israel. And as to the question whether this was or wasn't a drone, and it was or wasn't sent to Israel, well, we have the drone, we have the evidence that it was an Iranian drone, and anybody who doubts that should just look at the film and the footage which shows that this was an Iranian drone and it was sent into Israel. So if anybody doubts that, then he's just imagining and he's deluding himself and deluding your listeners.
Okay, so you both disagree over the drone. I want to pop out into the geopolitics a little. Marcus, one of the reasons why we invited you is you can help us understand the geopolitical angle, especially from the Russian perspective. And they've been interesting because the Israelis have essentially bombed 2 Russian allies in this war in Syria, the Syrian regime and the Iranians. Russia hasn't retaliated. Russia has condemned it, which has led some to believe that the Russians have given the Israelis the green light to act. Is that plausible?
No, I don't believe that's plausible at all. We have to remember that Russia has a very different stance on Israel compared to the stance that the former Soviet Union adopted towards Israel. Now, I don't happen to believe that the current day Russian policy on Israel is actually correct, but under no circumstances did Russia give the green light to Israel to attack Syria at the weekend. Russia is trying to defuse the situation. Russia has a fairly cordial relationship with Israel, and Mr. Putin made it very clear that Syria's sovereignty must be respected, and he told Mr. Netanyahu that in no uncertain terms. But Imran, if I may, the audacity of Israeli officials to cite the argument of sovereignty being violated is really extraordinary. Israel routinely violates Syrian airspace, thereby Syrian sovereignty, thereby international law. And the Israelis do it under the banner of defensive measures. Well, that is absolutely preposterous nonsense. If every country in the world behaved in the same manner as the Israelis do, there would be Armageddon. Israel is not above international law. Israel is not above the mechanisms of the United Nations. If Israel has a complaint, it should take it to the United Nations. And I will say this as well. Why doesn't our Israeli guest explain why Israel does not use its formidable air power against ISIS and al-qaeda in the Golan, which is only a stone's throw away from Turkish forces?
That's an interesting
maybe he can answer that question.
That's an interesting point. So, Alan Baker, one of the questions is, As much as you might hate Hezbollah and as much as they might be a national security threat to Israel, there's clear evidence that Hezbollah in the Golan Heights actively fights Khalid bin al-Walid forces, which are a Daesh affiliate, right? So they're fighting them in the Golan Heights, but Israel wants to bomb Hezbollah. Doesn't Marcus make a fair point? Why is Hezbollah more of an enemy than an actual Daesh affiliate in the Golan Heights?
Look, whoever doesn't threaten Israel, Israel's got no reason to defend itself against them. That's the very simple formula.
So you believe it's correct to treat al-Qaeda fighters
as long
in
as
your
Hezbollah,
hospitals? Is that correct?
Excuse me, I didn't interrupt you. Would you please be cultured
well, I think the
and
world
allow
should
me to
know
speak?
why Israel treats wounded al-Qaeda fighters in their hospitals.
If you're not, I'm sorry, you're interrupting me,
Go ahead,
which is
Alan.
very impolite.
Al-Qaeda is a murderous, evil organisation,
no, I'm
and
sorry.
you treat their fighters in your hospitals.
Okay, Marcus,
if you're not
Explain that
allowing
to the
me,
world.
Marcus, you made the point a few times. Alan, please go ahead.
If you're not allowing me to speak,
you're allowed to speak. Go ahead,
if you're not allowing
Alan.
me to speak, then there's no sense in continuing this discussion. I'm sorry. My answer to the question was that Israel will act only against those elements that threaten its sovereignty and its security. And if Hezbollah constitutes a threat to Israel's security, then Israel will find it necessary to defend itself. But if Hezbollah is acting against ISIS or whoever else it's acting against, that's got nothing to do with Israel, and it doesn't bother Israel.
Mohammed Marandi, the Israelis believe fundamentally that Iran is using the strategic advantage that it has in Syria right now, with the momentum being with the kind of Russian-Iranian Syrian government alliance. So they believe Iran is using that momentum to create a strategic advantage to then use to attack Israel through Hezbollah and others. Is that nonsense, or might there be some truth to it?
No, the Israelis don't even think that. That's the narrative of Israel. Israel is like its sister apartheid, the sister apartheid regime in South Africa that existed before. The apartheid regime in South Africa would constantly use communism to demonize the ANC.
Will you get to the point?
And the West would support of the apartheid regime. And that is exactly what the Israelis do.
Okay,
so
Alan,
even Nelson Mandela was considered to be a terrorist by the United States.
You're spouting cliches. Get to the point. Answer the question.
So this is what Israel does. It uses Iran as a scapegoat to justify the subjugation of the natives in Palestine, the Palestinian people, and to attack neighboring countries. Israel has no drone of Iran over its territory. It did not shoot it down. The Israelis bombed Syria on regular... And to answer Marcus, because he raised a good question, Marcus asked a good question.
I don't remember what the question was.
Why does Israel not attack ISIS? The defense intelligence chief of Israel
because ISIS isn't attacking Israel.
That Israel would prefer ISIS to the Syrian government, and that Israel is concerned
why should Israel attack
about
ISIS
the
if ISIS
defeat of ISIS.
Isn't attacking Israel?
So when the Minister of Defense, the former Minister of Defense, the former head of Mossad, and the head of military intelligence for Israel speak like that, it shows the relationship between Israel and the extremists.
Alan, let me ask you this.
Israel gives humanitarian assistance. Israel helps people who are wounded.
Can I jump in?
It doesn't matter where they come from.
Okay, Alan, let me ask you. Marcus, I'm going to come to you in a second. Marcus, I'm going to come to you in a second. Alan, let me ask you. Hezbollah, interestingly, said the downing of the Israeli F-16 marked the start of a new strategic phase. And they also said today's developments mean the old equations have categorically ended. When you hear that from Hezbollah, Alan, as somebody who advised the Israeli army, the IDF, what do you think they mean, Alan?
I don't think they mean anything. They're simply persuading themselves that they've achieved a major victory without really taking into consideration what exactly happened on Saturday. How many Iranian and Syrian positions were destroyed as a result of this drone entering into Israeli territory. So they're simply misleading themselves and their public into believing that this was a great victory. They managed to shoot down an Israeli plane. It's a new game. It's a load of rubbish, I'm sorry.
Marcus, you want to jump in?
Al-Qaeda is one of the most vile, repugnant, evil organizations in the world. In fact, one of the most evil that mankind has ever known. It massacred thousands of innocent civilians on 9/11. It massacred civilians in Madrid, in Bali, in London. The list goes on and on and on. And Israel treats al-Qaeda fighters who have been wounded in battle against the Syrian army. The Israelis treat al-Qaeda fighters in Israeli hospitals. The world should know that.
We'd even treat you, Marcus,
the world
if
should
you were
know
wounded.
that Israel is allied unofficially to both al-Qaeda and ISIS. In my opinion, al-Qaeda fighters should be left to die on the battlefield. But for the Israelis, they treat them in their hospitals and then they send them back into the Golan to fight the Syrian army. You should be absolutely ashamed of yourself for treating al-Qaeda fighters and for supporting the treatment of al-Qaeda fighters.
So if your hatred is so deep
I think
that
Israel
you're prepared to leave wounded people, then you have a problem with yourself, Marcus.
You do not
You have a
treat
problem,
al-Qaeda
Marcus.
fighters.
I suggest you get examined.
Go to Washington, go to New York and say that to the families of the victims of 9/11, that it's a good thing to treat al-Qaeda fighters. I don't believe it's good to treat al-Qaeda fighters.
Marcus, you're getting off the point again.
On the battlefield.
Okay,
You're
I think it's
getting
pretty
off the
clear that you
point,
both disagree
Marcus.
over this. Okay, fair enough. And Alan says, well, al-Qaeda's not firing rockets at them, so they don't have a problem with them for the moment. That's where he stands. Marcus, this is where we leave you.
Why don't al-Qaeda attack Israel? That's a good question, isn't it?
Okay, this is interesting, and you've posed some interesting questions. Marcus, this is where we leave you at this point in the discussion, because we're going to move on. We're going to talk about the border wall in Lebanon, but I thank you so much for your contribution. Alan, you stay where you are.